Washington, D.C., June 23, 1906. The vote is being counted in the United States Senate. The final tally comes in. Only 20 members of Congress, out of the entire legislative body of the United States, vote against the Pure Food and Drug Act. The bill passes. The president signs it. And somewhere outside that chamber, a food manufacturer from Pittsburgh is watching, and he is not surprised. He had spent years on this. He lobbied congressmen, wrote letters, met with the president personally. He bankrolled the campaign, supplied the science, pressured the wavering. In public, he said it was about protecting American consumers from the poison being sold to them in grocery stores. And that was true. What he did not say in public was this. By the day that bill passed, he was the only major ketchup maker in the entire country who didn't need the chemical it had just effectively banned. Every one of his competitors did, and without it, their product would rot on the shelf. He had used the government of the United States to destroy his rivals, and he had done it while being celebrated as a hero of public health. His name was Henry J. Heinz. And what happened on that June afternoon in 1906 was just the most audacious chapter in a 50-year campaign to put his red bottle on every table on Earth. Before we get into how he pulled that off, where are you watching this from? Drop your city or your country in the comments. Genuinely curious how far this one travels. Now, let's start at the very beginning, which is not where you think it is. Washington, D.C. is the end of the story. The beginning is a dock in Southeast Asia, in the 17th century, and it has nothing to do with tomatoes. The word ketchup does not come from English. It doesn't come from French or Italian or any of the languages we associate with culinary tradition. It comes from the Hokkien Chinese dialect, spoken along the coast of the Fujian province. The word is ketchup. What it described was a fermented fish sauce, dark, pungent, salty, made by packing fish with salt and letting it break down over months in clay pots. That sauce had been produced along the rivers and coastlines of Southeast Asia for generations. It wasn't a condiment in the way we think about condiments. It was closer to a flavor base, a way of adding depth to food before the word umami existed in any Western language. In the mid-1600s, Dutch and British trading ships began arriving in the ports of what is now Indonesia, Malaysia, and southern China. They were there for silk, porcelain, and tea. They also discovered this sauce, and they took it home. By the early 1700s, something called ketchup had found a permanent place on British tables. But the British version bore almost no resemblance to the original. The fish was largely gone. What replaced it was whatever was local, whatever was cheap, and whatever could be boiled down into a thin, dark, savory sauce. Mushrooms, walnuts, oysters, anchovies. One recipe from the period called for 100 oysters, 3 pints of white wine, and a fistful of spices. There was turtle ketchup. There was mussel ketchup. The word ketchup, by the early 1800s, meant any number of thin, intense sauces that bore only a family resemblance to each other. Jane Austen's household made walnut ketchup. Her friend Martha Lloyd kept the recipe: green walnuts pounded with salt, boiled with vinegar, cloves, mace, ginger, nutmeg, pepper, horseradish, and shallots. This wasn't a curiosity. It was a staple. British colonists brought their ketchups to America, where local ingredients produced local variations. And it was in America, in 1812, that a Philadelphia scientist named James Meese published the first known recipe for a tomato-based ketchup. He called tomatoes love apples, a name left over from an era when people weren't entirely sure whether tomatoes were a food or a poison. Meese's recipe still contained anchovies. The fish sauce ancestry hadn't fully let go. By the middle of the 19th century, the anchovy was fading. Sugar was coming in. Tomato ketchup was gaining ground in American kitchens, but the commercial versions available in stores were genuinely alarming. Manufacturers used tomato scraps, skins, seeds, cores, whatever was left after better processing, thickened the mash with ground pumpkin rind or apple pulp, dyed it red with coal tar, and preserved it with chemicals no one had tested on anyone. One French cookbook author of the era described the ketchup sitting on American grocery shelves as filthy, decomposed, and putrid. That wasn't hyperbole. It was an accurate description of the product. Into this world, in 1844, a child was born in Birmingham, Pennsylvania, the eldest of 8 children of German immigrants named Frederick and Margareta Heinz. When the boy was 5, the family moved a few miles north to the village of Sharpsburg. And in the garden behind the family house, Henry John Heinz began to grow things. He was 8 years old when he started selling surplus vegetables to neighbors, 12 when the route expanded beyond the street, 16 when he had his first employees. The kid wasn't dabbling. He was building something, and even then, the business instinct and the moral instinct moved together. He had been raised with strict Lutheran faith, and one of his mother's rules, one he carried for the rest of his life, was this: always place yourself in the other person's shoes. It sounds like a sentiment. In Henry Heinz's hands, it became the core of a global strategy. In 1869, Heinz went into business properly. He was 25. He partnered with a friend named Clarence Noble, and together they founded Heinz and Noble Company, operating out of the basement of his father's former house in Sharpsburg. Their first product was horseradish. At the time, commercial horseradish was almost universally sold in brown or opaque bottles. The reason was simple: manufacturers were cutting it with fillers, turnip, sawdust, wood pulp, anything to stretch the product and pad the margin. The opaque bottle hid the evidence. Every competitor was selling a lie, and the lie was invisible because the container made it invisible. Heinz packed his horseradish in clear glass. That was the whole move. Not a revolutionary recipe, not a lower price. A clear bottle. Come and look at what we're selling you. Nothing to hide. It was an act of transparency so simple that it looked obvious, and so rare in that market that it looked radical. The business grew. Heinz added sauerkraut, then vinegar, then pickles. And then, in 1873, the financial world collapsed. The Panic of 1873 was one of the worst economic contractions of the 19th century. Banks failed, credit dried up, commodity prices cratered. Horseradish had been oversupplied. Prices fell off a cliff. Heinz and Noble couldn't survive it. The company went bankrupt in 1875, and Henry Heinz found himself personally liable for debts he had no means to repay. He recorded the figures in his diary with the kind of methodical precision a man uses when he's trying to make a painful reality feel manageable. He was finished. Except that he wasn't. On New Year's Day, 1876, Heinz called a family meeting. He explained the situation plainly. No money, no company, but a plan. If certain family members were willing to form a new business, he would work on salary and run the operation. His brother John agreed. His cousin Frederick agreed. His wife Sarah agreed. They named the new company F&J Heinz. They started with 53 employees, and among the first products on the line was something Heinz had been thinking about: a tomato condiment, bottled, pure, sold in clear glass. They called it catsup. The 1876 version of Heinz catsup was made from 5 simple ingredients: sun-ripened whole tomatoes, distilled vinegar, brown sugar, salt, and spices. No scraps, no fillers, no coal tar dye, no pumpkin rind. The tomatoes mattered enormously. Most commercial ketchup of the era was made from whatever the canneries left behind after the better product had been sold: bruised skins, overripe cores, the parts no one wanted. The result was thin, inconsistent, and prone to fermenting in the bottle. Heinz sourced only ripe, whole tomatoes and was obsessive about it. The quality was visible, and because the bottle was clear, the quality was literal. You could hold it up to the light and see exactly what was inside. The price was higher than competitors. That was the point. Heinz wasn't competing on price. He was competing on trust. In a market where every other bottle was hiding something, that was a genuinely unusual position, and it worked. The business grew through the late 1870s and into the 1880s. Heinz bought out his partners in 1888 and renamed the company the H.J. Heinz Company. The iconic octagonal glass bottle, with its 8 sides specifically designed to prevent counterfeiting, arrived in 1889 and was patented in 1890. By the mid-1880s, Heinz was the dominant ketchup brand in Pittsburgh, with a growing regional reputation and a product he was genuinely proud of. It wasn't enough. In 1886, Heinz booked passage to England. He was 42. He brought 5 cases of products with him: ketchup, baked beans, cream of tomato soup, a handful of other items. He had no appointment. He walked into Fortnum and Mason, the luxury grocery store on Piccadilly that had been supplying the British royal family since 1707, and asked to show his products to the buyer. The buyer tasted what Heinz had brought, and then he purchased the entire stock, all 5 cases, on the spot. Walking out of that store, Heinz reportedly said, "Our field is the world." If you're finding this story as absorbing as we hoped, consider subscribing. There's a lot more history like this waiting for you, and it tends to get stranger the deeper you go. What happened in Britain over the following decades is one of the stranger chapters in food history. An American brand, built in Pittsburgh by the son of German immigrants, became more embedded in British daily life than most domestic products ever managed. By 1905, Heinz had opened its first overseas factory in Peckham, London. By 1907, annual production had reached 12 million bottles, with exports reaching Japan, South America, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. The same strategy that had worked in Pittsburgh was working everywhere. Visible quality, premium ingredients, a clear bottle that signaled nothing to hide. Then came the Second World War. Britain in the early 1940s was rationing everything. Ingredients were scarce, supply chains were disrupted, and Heinz tomato ketchup disappeared from British shelves. Not for a few months, for 10 years. An entire generation of British children grew up without it. What did not disappear was Heinz baked beans. The Ministry of Food classified them as an essential food, a wartime staple to be rationed and distributed because people needed them to survive. An American product had been declared a British necessity during the country's worst crisis in living memory. In 1954, Queen Elizabeth II granted Heinz a royal warrant. The company now officially supplied the royal household. A sauce that started in a Pittsburgh basement, built by the son of German immigrants, sold first to a London luxury grocer on an unannounced visit, had become so woven into British life that the monarchy attached its name to it. Heinz would have considered that entirely reasonable. But while the British market was consolidating around his brand, something back in America was about to reshape the entire ketchup industry. And before that story can be told, there's one moment, on an elevated train in New York City in 1896, that needs to happen first. Heinz was riding uptown when he spotted an advertising placard in the train car, a shoe store. It read, 21 styles. He looked at that number and felt something click. Not the product, the number, the specificity of it. 21 didn't mean every style. It meant exactly these styles, chosen and counted. It suggested authority without requiring proof. It was the kind of precision that made you trust the person saying it, even if you had no way to verify it. Within a week, Heinz had invented the slogan that would define his company for the next century. 57 varieties. There was one problem, and Heinz was fully aware of it. His company was already selling more than 60 products. 57 was not a count of anything. He chose it the way a poet chooses a word, for how it felt. He later explained that the number 7 had what he called the psychological influence of that figure and its alluring significance to people of all ages and races. 58 didn't appeal to him. 56 didn't either. 57 felt right. He got off the train and started making arrangements. Within a week, the slogan was appearing in newspapers and on billboards. The company carved 57 into hillsides so passengers on passing trains could read it from the windows. And in 1900, Heinz erected the first electric billboard in New York City. 6 stories high, 1,200 light bulbs, blazing the words across the Manhattan skyline. 57 good things for the table. The slogan dominated the company's advertising for the next 70 years. By the early 21st century, Heinz was marketing more than 5,700 products worldwide. The number on the bottle had never meant anything real. It never stopped working. There's a footnote to this that almost no one knows. The embossed 57 on the neck of the glass bottle does something very specific, something functional that Henry Heinz never planned and couldn't have anticipated. But to understand that, you first need to understand what he was about to do to everyone else in his industry. Because in 1904, a federal chemist in Washington named Harvey Wiley had just declared war on the American food supply, and Heinz, who still had a problem he hadn't solved, was about to make the most calculated alliance of his career. By 1904, Heinz had a problem. His ketchup still contained sodium benzoate. So did everyone else's. The chemical was a preservative. It slowed fermentation, extended shelf life, kept ketchup from going moldy between the factory and the grocery shelf. German chemists had synthesized it in 1860, and American food manufacturers had adopted it broadly in the decades since. It was in ketchup, in canned goods, in pickles, in virtually everything processed and bottled for commercial sale. Harvey Washington Wiley, the chief chemist in Theodore Roosevelt's Department of Agriculture, was convinced it was dangerous. Wiley was a trained physician with the intensity of someone who believed he had identified a threat that the public couldn't yet see. To build his case, he assembled a group of 12 government employees who volunteered to eat food deliberately mixed with significant amounts of various chemical additives: borax, saltpeter, sulfuric acid, formaldehyde, and sodium benzoate, and then documented the effects on their health over time. The newspapers called them the Poison Squad, and the experiments were front-page news across the country. People who had never thought about food additives started paying attention to what they were eating. Wiley's evidence against sodium benzoate was, by later scientific standards, not airtight. He was certain it was harmful. The data was more complicated. Decades later, researchers would find that sodium benzoate in combination with vitamin C can form trace amounts of benzene, a known carcinogen, though at the concentrations found in food, the risk remained a matter of ongoing debate. But Wiley pushed forward, loudly and publicly, and the campaign landed. Into this environment, Heinz made a decision. By his own account, and that of his biographers, he was genuinely uncomfortable with artificial preservatives. But he was also a businessman with extraordinary competitive awareness. And what he knew, by around 1904, was something his competitors didn't yet realize he knew. His chief scientist, G.F. Mason, had spent years trying to crack a preservative-free ketchup formula. The challenge was real. Without sodium benzoate, ketchup fermented quickly, grew mold, and became unsellable. Every previous attempt had failed. Mason solved it. The answer turned out to be something American home cooks had understood intuitively for generations. Use only fully ripe tomatoes, never scraps. Increase the acidity with more vinegar. Sanitize the equipment without compromise. Cook the product properly. The natural acidity and the vinegar together created an environment hostile enough to bacterial growth that no preservative was needed. By 1906, Heinz was producing 5 million bottles of preservative-free ketchup annually, and then he went to Congress. What followed was one of the more consequential lobbying campaigns in American business history. Heinz allied himself publicly with Wiley. He testified. He funded. He lobbied Roosevelt directly. That same year, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, exposing the horrors of the meatpacking industry, and the public appetite for food safety regulation reached a breaking point. The Pure Food and Drug Act moved toward a vote. The ketchup industry mobilized against it. The manufacturers who depended on sodium benzoate went to Washington and told him directly, that it was physically impossible to make shelf-stable ketchup without chemical preservatives. They said Heinz's claims were fabrications. They warned that without benzoate, bottles would explode on store shelves. They spread rumors about Wiley, called for his firing, and tried to have him discredited in the press. Roosevelt stood by him. June 23, 1906. The Pure Food and Drug Act passed with 20 opposing votes. After the vote, Wiley wrote to Heinz, "I feel I should have lost the fight if I had not had that assistance." By 1911, Heinz's thicker, more expensive, preservative-free ketchup dominated the American market. The companies that had built their business on sodium benzoate were gone, or close enough to it that the distinction barely mattered. One historian described Heinz's motivation as idealism and noble purpose compounded with self-interest. That may be the most honest sentence ever written about the man. He genuinely believed in pure food. He also understood that pure food, enforced by law, would leave him as the only viable seller of ketchup in America. Both things were true, simultaneously and without contradiction. If that kind of history is what you came for, hit the like button. It genuinely helps, and there's a lot more of this to come. There is one part of the Heinz story that gets less attention than the ketchup, less than the lobbying, less than the marketing genius. It is what he built for the people who worked for him. Industrial Pittsburgh in the late 19th century was brutal by any measure. The steel mills ran 12-hour shifts. The coal mines had no meaningful safety standards. The railroad companies cut wages without warning and sent in the National Guard when workers struck. In the summer of 1877, 29 people, strikers and guardsmen together, were killed in Pittsburgh labor violence. It was the worst unrest the city had seen in a generation, and it left a mark on everyone who witnessed it, including a young condiment manufacturer watching from Sharpsburg. Heinz decided his factory would be different. By the turn of the century, the Pittsburgh plant had amenities that workers in virtually any other American industry couldn't have imagined: a swimming pool, a gymnasium, a rooftop garden, an auditorium for concerts and lectures, a library, free sewing and cooking classes, carriage rides through city parks in summer, boat trips on the rivers. The factory employed a full-time company doctor, a nurse, a dentist, and a manicurist. The manicurist serving as both a genuine perk and a practical hygiene measure for workers handling food. Women were given fresh uniforms each day. There were showers and changing rooms. The dining rooms were decorated with art. Heinz's stated reasoning was simple: the working day should be happy. He introduced profit sharing in the 1890s. He reduced the workday from 9 hours to 8 in 1902 and implemented paid vacations, both measures coming decades before any federal requirement. He knew many of his employees by name. A prominent philanthropist who visited the plant around the turn of the century said that among all the factories he had seen, the home of the 57 was the most remarkable. There were no unions at Heinz for 69 years. From 1869 to 1938, through the entire era of American labor organizing, through the New Deal, through the most intense period of industrial unrest in the country's history, not one successful organizing drive, which is a remarkable record and one worth sitting with for a moment. The amenities Heinz provided were genuine. They were also structurally designed to make union membership feel unnecessary. He gave his employees more than the law required and more than the market demanded. He gave them no independent voice. Both things are part of the same story. When Henry John Heinz died on May 14, 1919, the company had 6,500 employees, 25 branch factories, and operations on 6 continents. His employees collected money among themselves and commissioned a bronze statue in his honor. In the long history of American industrial capitalism, that kind of tribute, workers funding a monument to the man who owned them, is nearly without precedent. What it tells you about Heinz is something genuinely complicated, that a person can be, at once, idealistic and calculating, generous and self-serving, and that in the right proportions, those qualities together can build something that outlasts any one of them. The empire he left behind would, 94 years after his death, pass to people he would not have recognized. February 14, 2013. Valentine's Day. Berkshire Hathaway and a Brazilian private equity firm called 3G Capital announced the acquisition of the H.J. Heinz Company for $28 billion. It was, at that moment, the largest food industry acquisition in history. Warren Buffett called the brand iconic. The deal closed in June. Within 2 years, 3G had cut 7,000 workers. Plants closed. Corporate positions were eliminated. Profits surged 35%. 2 years after that, 3G and Buffett merged Heinz with Kraft Foods, creating the third largest food and beverage company in North America. More cuts followed. The company that Henry Heinz built on the conviction that the working day should be happy was now run by a financial consortium whose primary expertise was removing cost. The irony is almost architectural. It fits together too cleanly to have been planned. What survived all of it, through every restructuring and balance sheet adjustment, was the bottle. The clear glass bottle, octagonal sides, red interior visible through the glass, the 57 embossed on the neck. That number, the fake, invented, never accurate, always effective number. It turns out it does something. Here is something that Heinz has confirmed, that has been on their own website for years, and that approximately 89% of people who use their ketchup have never discovered. Ketchup is what physicists call a non-Newtonian fluid. Unlike water or oil, it doesn't flow predictably in response to gravity. Below a certain pressure threshold, it behaves like a solid. It sits there. You tilt the bottle at 45 degrees, nothing. You tilt it further, still nothing. You shake it over your plate, and either nothing comes out, or you finally cross the threshold, and it suddenly becomes 1,000 times thinner than a moment before, and you have completely overwhelmed your French fries in a single catastrophic pour. Heinz ketchup, when properly formulated, flows at approximately 0.028 miles per hour. If a batch flows faster than that, Heinz considers it incorrectly made. The technique for the glass bottle is this. Hold it at a 45-degree angle and tap the embossed 57 on the neck firmly. The neck is where the bottle narrows, where the ketchup is already closest to the opening. The tap disrupts the surface tension. The ketchup flows. That's it. It's on Heinz's website. 9 out of 10 people have never found it. Henry Heinz invented the number 57 on a train in New York in 1896 because it sounded authoritative. He placed it on the neck of the bottle because that's where the label sat. And more than a century later, it turns out the number he made up marks the exact spot you need to touch to make the thing work. The invented number became the real answer. He would have found that deeply satisfying. The bottle itself kept evolving. In 1983, Heinz introduced the plastic squeeze bottle, and ketchup sales rose nearly 4% the following year. The era of smacking the glass bottom finally had an alternative. In 2002, the upside-down bottle arrived. Cap moved to the bottom, ketchup always waiting at the opening. Obvious in retrospect, the way the best ideas always are. But restaurants still reach for the glass bottle. Diners prefer it, because the glass bottle, with its clear walls and red interior visible from across the room, communicates something the plastic version doesn't. It tells you what's inside. And what's inside is worth knowing. Ripe tomatoes, distilled vinegar, sugar, salt, spices, no artificial preservatives. Not since Heinz's scientist cracked the formula in 1904. The same basic commitment printed on the label in 1876 is printed on the label today. Though one detail is worth noting, the ketchup in an American bottle and the ketchup in a British bottle are not identical. The American version uses high fructose corn syrup. The British version uses sugar and contains more tomato, 148 grams of tomatoes per 100 grams of finished ketchup. Same brand, same bottle, same philosophy. Different formula for a different palate. If you've ever tasted Heinz in the United Kingdom and thought something was slightly different, you were right. The ketchup was certified by NASA for use on the International Space Station in the 1990s. It is found in 97% of American homes. More than 650 million bottles are sold worldwide every year. Let's go back to where this started. Not to the Senate chamber in 1906, not to the Fortnum and Mason cold call in 1886, not even to the Pittsburgh basement in 1869. Back to the dock, 17th century Southeast Asia, a Dutch trading ship, sailors encountering a fermented fish sauce in a market they barely understood, buying a jar of it, carrying it across an ocean. That sauce traveled through British kitchens and became walnut ketchup. It crossed the Atlantic and became oyster ketchup and turtle ketchup, and eventually, awkwardly, a thin tomato liquid that a French chef described as decomposed. It sat in that form, barely recognizable, chemically preserved, nutritionally suspect, until a bankrupt horseradish salesman from Sharpsburg, Pennsylvania, rebuilt his life on New Year's Day of 1876 and decided, for the second time, that transparency was worth more than concealment. He was right. Not just morally, competitively. The clear bottle was a business strategy that also happened to be an ethical position, which is maybe the rarest combination in the history of American commerce. He used it to win a grocery buyer in London. He used it to justify a federal law that eliminated his competitors. He used it to build factories that treated workers better than anywhere else in industrial America, in part because treating them well kept them loyal, and keeping them loyal kept them unorganized. The idealism and the calculation were never separate. They were the engine. What he left behind is a product that has outlasted its founder, outlasted its original corporate structure, outlasted the regulatory battles that made it dominant, outlasted the glass bottles he first designed for it. Almost. The glass bottle is still around. Restaurants still prefer it. Because the clear glass, after all these years, still does what it was always meant to do. It shows you what's inside. There's a word for what Heinz built, and it's not ketchup, it's trust. He manufactured trust at industrial scale, bottled it in glass you could see through, and sold it to the world at a premium. A fake number nobody questioned, a political campaign that looked like altruism, a factory full of swimming pools and no union hall, a clear bottle that said "look inside," knowing that anyone who looked would see exactly what he wanted them to see. The sauce in that bottle started as Chinese fish brine, carried by Dutch sailors, transformed by British cooks, shaped by a German immigrant's faith in American consumers, and it is now, on this particular Tuesday or Saturday, or whenever you're watching this, sitting in 97% of American refrigerators. It has a royal warrant. NASA put it in orbit. A company worth billions carries the name of a man who went bankrupt at 30. Hold the bottle at a 45-degree angle. Tap the 57. It comes right out.